as we say in the film, we have to establish harmony with our whole environment, and that means the non-living environment, the living natural environment, the community of other human beings, and as I said in the film, first and foremost, within ourselves. And I'm never embarrassed to say that in California. But in some parts of the country, it's a little bit harder.
And so to your right, Michael, is Jim Schuyler. Sky, you have done such a beautiful job with the music for this film. I think he deserves a round of applause, and more than that. How was it creating the soundtrack and the music for this film? How did you do it?
The process is very interactive. It really comes down to the interplay between myself and the film editor. So Sarah, as editor, had some ideas what she was looking for. I want the viewers and the audience to come out of the showing like whistling the tune. And I also... You got it. You got it. So what we do is we work on finding something that's supportive of the emotional arc at the particular time. So in a scene where there's conflict coming up, we support that conflict without being too overbearing about it. Where we're looking for calmness, we do something that's calm. And I will say, I've probably seen this film about as many times as you've seen it, at least 50. But
who's counting?
But seldom from start to finish. Always one scene at a time. So it's really gratifying to be able to do it. And if I can just say one thing on behalf of musicians, because I always like to do this, musicians really struggle to make a living these days. I have no problem with it. I scored the film for free. But it does cost sometimes to record, and musicians need to be paid. So we try to do that from the streams. I have some cards here that people can take after the event that will lead you right to the streams online. So the music for the film, the soundtrack album, is on approximately 80 streaming services.
The one, I guess, song or that comes to mind is it's like piano and cello, like a little bit of that. So what was your besides the arc of the film itself? I mean, it takes a visionary as well to hear what this should sound like, which instruments to use.
So you're talking about the opening scene,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there are two things going on there. One is it's Stephanie's voice, and the other is that it's the birds. And so the music really mimics what's going on the screen.
Yeah.
It starts out with a sitar. So the sitar represents a sitar drone, and the drone kind of represents what's happening with those birds that are flying around there. And when your voice comes, I mean, there are the two birds on the telephone line too, but when your voice comes in, it's like the da-da-dum, da-dum. So what it's doing is it's just giving you a nice, calm opening, but then perking up a little bit of attention.
I can't hear. We can't hear you.
Okay. Do I need to repeat some of that?
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
Hold the mic a little closer.
Yeah, okay. My mic's a little low too.
Thank you.
So in that opening scene, what happens is it starts with a sitar drone, and the sitar drone is very much like the birds as the birds are flying around. And the piano opening where it goes ba-lum, ba-lum, ba-bum, is very much like the voice. So Stephanie's voice begins to narrate there. And so it actually mimics what's going on the screen. And you'll find there are a lot of things that we call Easter eggs in this film. So in David Hartsell's section, for instance, you'll hear "We Shall Overcome." That was really pretty obvious. But also in Awad's story, there's another melody that is associated with the Middle East that appears there. I'll leave it to you to find it.
Thank you, Sky.
So maybe just to kind of reflect on the section we saw earlier with my colleagues Andres and Derek. In South Sudan Nonviolent Peace Force, like all of the countries we operate in, we were invited there by a local organization. So we came in 2011, right before the referendum, to monitor it and to see if there would be any support we could give in a peaceful transition. And I came in for the referendum, so I was there then until about 2013. So right before I left, to first start off that there was a peaceful transition. So South Sudan is now its own country ever since 2011, and that did go well. But 2013, the country fell into civil war and is currently in the same status as we had previously seen. So when that happened, there are many areas that they call as POCs, and they're civilian encampments, basically, where people could go to and humanitarian actors could give services. So Nonviolent Peace Force, we are in almost all of the POCs, as well as in lots of other areas. And there's a huge array of different work that we do when it comes to protection work. It can be very, very small things and very, very big things, and it's really situational. So we have a lot of women's peace teams that we work with. We go and we walk with children sometimes to areas that they might not feel comfortable in. We meet with local leaders, with youth groups, with military, with police, and we talk about the protection situation, especially with all the humanitarian actors as well. So we serve a lot as the voice, and we raise the voice of the local people who would like their voice raised as to what the situation is going on, so that they are not ignored. Because it's very often that people who are facing violence or victims of violence are not being listened to. So we help amplify their voice to all different types of actors. So I'm not sure what type of stories you want me to go into. Maybe I'll stop there, but that's basically the main part of the work that we do. In South Sudan, we work in English and operate in English, but there's hundreds of languages. So the thing that's really important that we do is we hire national staff and we train them and we lift them up. And the internationals as expats, we actually have a back seat in the work. They're the ones giving trainings. They're the ones speaking on behalf of the communities. They're the ones speaking in the languages of the different groups that we're talking to. So the internationals are not necessarily in the forefront. We're only there when it's important for an international to be there, or we're there to help open doors, to have meetings with the UN and so on. So it really depends on what the situation is, on how we support, but it's a lot of work, and it's very, very, very tiring, and it's very, very rewarding.
Okay, good. So Nonviolent Peace Force, after being in service for about 20 years, we're really quite spread over the globe. We're in the Mindanao area of the Philippines. We're in South Sudan. We've just started a project in Sudan itself, in the Darfur region. We're also in Iraq, Myanmar. We're starting a project in Thailand to support our work in Myanmar and also in Thailand. And we just have sent an assessment team into Ukraine. So, and we're in the United States. We started a program in the United States in 2020. And that's one of our newest programs. So we're still growing and getting that off the ground. But the main places where you can find our work in the United States is in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. Our US office just happened to be in the middle of the uprising that occurred after the death of George Floyd. And so we could no longer say that we didn't need a program in the United States. It was very clear, and we knew that, but everybody really came on board after that happening. And we're also doing some work in New York. We have a team in New York that have been focusing on combating anti-Asian violence and have been doing trainings along with the Asian American Federation of New York City. They do trainings about every couple of weeks, actually, currently virtually because of the pandemic, but they do sometimes do them in person as well. And we're now looking at doing some work in rural Minnesota because there's a part of rural Minnesota that is still so divided. Actually, it's like the rest of our country, right? We're all still very divided. That in this particular part of rural Minnesota, there's a group of folks who are very much leaning to different sides of the spectrum, right? You get the picture. They're always at each other's throats, and folks are starting to feel like, wow, this could break out into violence at any time. So we're working with that community, and we're hoping to come up with a program and a project over the next 2 or 3 years that can be emulated and done in other parts of the United States. So keep your fingers crossed, and I highly recommend that you follow the progress of this work because it's the thing that's giving me the most hope that maybe we can move away from some of our divisiveness in this country and really try to come back together and find an area where we can find practical, pragmatic things that will bring us working together and get past our division. I'm so grateful that Nonviolent Peace Force provides a voice that is nonpartisan, that's grounded in nonviolence. And maybe the thing that really drew me to Nonviolent Peace Force was it was civilians helping civilians. This is a place where we can all put some energy. I was so frustrated and tired of seeing governments and militaries failing to protect civilians. I felt so powerless. And then 20 years ago, when I came across a group, Nonviolent Peace Force, that said, no, civilians can do more. Civilians can find ways to keep other civilians safer. And I was like, sign me up. So I've been spending the last 20 years trying to make sure that people know that this is an option, and it's something that we could all put our energy into. Different levels. You don't have to go to South Sudan, but you can support somebody who's willing to go. So.
Thank you. You are a high school teacher, and I just feel like your perspective and what you have to say as somebody committed to nonviolence and yet also working in the school system, tell us about what that's been like and what you think people can do.
Thank you, Stephanie, for inviting me here today for this. I have to admit, this topic is still very raw for me. The week that Uvalde happened, the week before that happened, we had police officers in our school. And keep in mind, the school that I teach at is a private school, well-funded, top 3% of Orange County. You would not think that there would be any fear of any gun violence in this demographic. But we had a potential threat on campus the week before Uvalde happened. 2 weeks after that, we had a credible threat, and we had to shut the entire school down. And even Uvalde, I think Berkeley High School had to shut down. Many of you guys know about that. And my old middle school in Southern California, they had to shut down with a credible threat as well. So a lot of these credible threats are actually rising even just within our own experiences. We all know somebody that's in a school that's probably experienced it since that happened. Gosh, I can't say that I have an answer for that, but Gilda, you saying that Nonviolent Peace Force is creating programs in the United States, I think that's something that we need to address with ourselves, that we really need here. I think some of us know that Amnesty International has actually labeled the United States as a terrorist country because of our gun violence. So we need Nonviolent Peace Force here, you know. And some of the responses that some schools are having with the funding, you know, my school is doing this, and I'm a little bit upset about it because we need to be moving towards more of a system of restorative justice, more preventative strategies, you know, more funding into counseling as opposed to policing and punishment in schools. You know, we have so many studies showing that those methods are not really working and actually creates more violence in schools. But the reaction of some schools are to increase security and to actually create more campus police, even after BLM. So we really need to push back on this because it's obviously reactive and it's only going to cause more of what we don't want. So that's kind of at the school level. But also, you know, advocating for stricter or just more reasonable gun laws, really, if we really think about it. There are actually studies out there that demonstrate that a lot of gun owners, most gun owners actually want stricter gun laws as well. So a lot of us who think that we're on polarizing sides, we're actually all on the same side on the gun issue, but we're not, but it's kind of like the higher ups that are not representing us, you know? So we need to gain that strength with each other and recognize we're all actually all on the same page to prevent this gun violence, you know, and to be strengthened on that level and not be afraid of any kind of voices that are telling us otherwise. I think that's about all I have to say about that.
Well,
In Minneapolis, actually, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, gave a grant to the school district in Minneapolis called the Peaceful Schools Program. And so we are working with schools and students. Students are being invited to be involved to what do they think would increase security in their schools. So, you know, they're usually like the last people asked, and they have to deal with it every day, day in, day out. They know what the threats are. They can kind of see where the trouble's coming, but nobody asks them. So we at Nonviolent Peace Force believe very much in centering the people who are experiencing the most violence or are at the most threat, listen to them, work with them, empower them so they can improve their security without weapons. We all do things to improve our security without weapons. We have alarms in our home, we plan ahead, we think of like what we know are safe and less safe. We can expand on this. So I just wanted to give you a positive note that there is some work being done looking at reducing violence in schools. So that's another thing to follow on Nonviolent Peace Force's website if you like, and hopefully others will take it on because we certainly don't think we can do it by ourselves. We love to model and share everything that we have online so others can take it on, duplicate it, take what works for you, leave behind what doesn't. So, yeah, thanks.
I make the claim in the book, and many of us in the field feel confident that had nonviolent resistance been known, which is the point of the film, and if people had organized it well enough, that Hitler could have been stopped. In fact, there were some examples of this that it kind of sporadic, like the Rosenstrasse prison demonstration, where the Gestapo had to back down and release these Jewish men who had non-Jewish wives. We could have built on that. And the reason that we didn't is we didn't know about it. And so that's the importance, I think, of educational work in nonviolence. Well, you know, there actually was a beginning of a nonviolent resistance in Ukraine. There were quite a number of people involved, and I think it's the pity of it is that people that don't, as I say in the film, we don't learn from our own experiences sometimes because we don't have the right framework. Now, I think that situation with Putin's invasion of Ukraine is an ideal situation for nonviolence because the majority of the Soviet troops who are in there do not know why they're there. They don't want to be there. And there are several openings for turning that thing around. All it would take, well, it could take one of two things. It could take a major defection, which would be stunning. You know, of course, there are a lot of people in the Soviet Union and Russia, right? So they could be replaced. But it would be quite a demonstration of humanity. And the other thing it would take is some kind of, I'm afraid it would probably take some conspicuous act of sacrifice. That's, if you see, in nonviolence, we've developed at the Metta Center what we call an escalation curve. So if you intervene in a conflict at an early stage, it's not going to be too difficult, too painful to get it resolved. But this is not an early stage. This is the last possible stage. He's come in there with the tanks and the artillery and so forth. So while it would be difficult and it would require some sacrifice, I think people who simply refuse to comply with orders, refuse to run away when guns are pointed at them, and yes, some people would die. But are we going to say that people don't die in the military? That they just die in a framework where we can sort of relate to it, sort of understand. Then, of course, there are other avenues of persuasion that could be brought to bear. But I think the important laboratory is right there in Lviv and Kharkov and the other cities. And we know from history that these very courageous demonstrations by individuals willing to take a risk and sometimes paying the price, not as often as they would in war, but sometimes, they have a stunning effect. You're speaking to a better human being inside that person that is not being spoken to by his commanding officers or and so forth. So we know that these things work. We need to study them more, figure out when and exactly how to apply it. I have every confidence it could be made to work.
So how do we distribute the film?
Yeah, how do we get the film into especially educational institutions? Before I turn that over to Sky, I mentioned if you have some really old-fashioned equipment, there actually is a DVD, which we can sell you at the Metta Center, mettacenter.org. But
Yes, you can find it there. If you go to thirdharmony.org, you'll find ways of getting the film for schools, running community screenings on your own, obtaining the film, the book, the board game, as well as the soundtrack. Yeah. And you'll also see op-eds by Francesca, and there'll be a lot of information about Nonviolent Peace Force in one place or another. It's all over the place.
Yeah, that's thirdharmony.org.
Thirdharmony.org. Thank you.
Yeah.
Francesca and I are both returned Peace Corps volunteers. So Francesca, do you want to?
I can say a little bit of what I know. I was part of the Volunteer Advisory Committee when I was serving. And what the difficulty with the Peace Corps is because it's technically not, in the department that you think it might be. It's not. It's under the Department of Agriculture. So that makes it a little bit difficult to implement programs like this. And technically, the purpose of the Peace Corps is a peace and friendship organization, and not kind of like it's not like Nonviolent Peace Force where it trains people for civilian protection. But the way that I can see it, unless we do some systemic changes with the Peace Corps, is to have individual volunteers or maybe RPCV communities that are recruiting new volunteers and training them on the Nonviolent Peace Force level so that when they create the programs in their countries that they're serving, they can implement their own programs there. So that's kind of how I would see it working. Yeah.
And there is a Department of Peace. There's a bill for a Department of Peace. Can anybody here on the panel speak to the Department of Peace idea, or just to know that people are working on that? Somebody in the audience has their hand.
Yeah, the War Department was started in like 1798 or something, and we're still trying to get the Department of Peace.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Francesca is actually an NVC trainer, and Michael was friends with Marshall Rosenberg, so Yeah, I can. Does anybody want to speak to this? And sure, Tiffany and.
Nonviolent Communication was one of the member organizations that started off Nonviolent Peace Force. Nonviolent Peace Force was created by about 80 member organizations from all around the world that are committed to nonviolence, and Nonviolent Communication is one of them. And in the trainings that our protection officers receive, they learn about nonviolent communication if they don't already know about it.
Yeah, I might just mention that when I was first developing the idea of the third harmony, I went and spoke to Marshall Rosenberg with my heart in my mouth, waited to see what his reaction would be, and of course he took his time. He has his good sense of timing, and he said, "I'm psyched." Then I knew we were made. Yeah, as Kazu hinted, the first step you have to take in order to act nonviolently is to have some methodology for coping with the fear and anger that will come up in yourself. And so that's one dimension of how the mental health aspect comes in. Another dimension, they put this into stark relief, is the enormous trauma that people inflict on themselves by hurting others. The US military, the statistics are heartrending about the men who go out and do what their country wants them to do and get patted on the back and go home and commit suicide. Now, the exact opposite of that is people who dedicate themselves to nonviolence. I've been in this field for a long time, and I don't know of anybody who was so traumatized by an act of nonviolence that they offered to somebody, that it marked them in any way. I think that's one of the most important things to know and point out about nonviolence, is that, yeah, it requires work and it requires reconditioning ourselves, but we're actually getting out our ultimate human nature, and that this is a healing, health-giving thing. How does one come to the point of being willing to die in a situation like Ukraine? And the first part of your question was, people die in the military, and what exactly is the relationship there? I think there's a very profound psychological difference in the attitude of people who face death in the military, which I'm not belittling that and the level of courage that's involved in that, but they're trying to avoid suffering at all costs while inflicting suffering on others. Whereas the nonviolent actor is saying, no matter what, I will not inflict suffering on you. And if I have to take it, I will. And then historically, as Erica Chenoweth from Harvard was pointing out, that has a much more powerful effect in social change to make that kind of sacrifice willingly.
Tiffany?
I would say that in a practical sense, with organizations like Nonviolent Peace Force, there's always a risk associated to every profession in the world. And this type of work, doing UCP, unarmed civilian protection, also has a risk to it. However, we do really closely measure our risks when we go out into the field, when we meet with all the different stakeholders and actors. And our goal is to have everybody safe, the protection officers, the national staff, and the communities. So when we're going places, we really use a lot of our power in letting people know we're coming. This is when we're going to be there. This is how long we're going to be there. This is who's going to be there, so that we're not surprising anyone and scaring anyone and putting ourselves or our staff in danger when we're going. So we really are very, very careful when we're out in the field and with our national staff. Yeah.
I just want to add that from the very earliest days of UCP type work, Armed Civilian Peacekeeping, there had always been a component built in to take care of people when they came back. And, you know, that's such a contrast with the military, where people who are traumatized and try to get help from the VA, you know, there's one guy who's actually told, we don't deal with conscientious objectors here. And they threw him out. So it is this much more humane response and active as you might have expected.